in the Old Testament, in Genesis, there's this notion that not only did people become self-conscious because they did something, but they did this voluntarily, right? They made this decision on their own. So Milton puts words into God's mouth and says, "So will fall he," meaning the human being, "and his faithless progeny, whose fault? Whose but his own? Ingrate, he had of me all he could have. I made him just and right, sufficient to have stood, though free to fall." And then you think, well, maybe the notion of the heritable sin of Adam characterizing human beings and their fallen existential condition isn't just the black-hearted ravings of fundamentalist Southern Baptist lunatics, right? There's something to this. Human beings are the only creatures that seem to live at odds with their own experience, and it's not so unreasonable to suppose that it's our dawning capacity for self-consciousness that's put us in that uncomfortable position. So why do I associate the eating of the apple with self-consciousness? Well, it's because that's how the story lays itself out. You have the collateral evidence of the Buddha's story of enlightenment, right? His contact with death. You have multiple medieval representations of Eve offering to Adam not an apple but a skull. You have multiple representations of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in medieval iconography as not containing apples but containing skulls. And you have the statements that are within the context of Genesis itself. And the eyes of both of them were opened. And they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. Well, there's a lot of information packed into those two lines, right? What does it mean to have your eyes open? Well, half your brain is visual cortex. It's not unreasonable to presume that that means a quick magnification of consciousness. You're conscious during the day. That's when your eyes are open. Well, what happens when your eyes are open? Well, you know you're naked. Well, what does that mean? Well, you know you're vulnerable, right? To social comment, to social judgment, to dominance, hierarchy, status maneuvering, and to all the terrible things that the unknown world can wreak upon you. And so then what do? Well, you create culture, right? And that's what this little sentence says. And they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. It's a pretty eventful sequence, all crammed up in two little sentences. So then what happens? I think it's extremely interesting. So before Adam and Eve figure out that they're naked, they're cruising around the garden having a fine time, doing whatever they want. They don't take any thought for the future, right? They don't have a prefrontal cortex. They're living in a paradoxless environment, like an animal lives. Well, what happens after they become self-conscious? Well, prior to this, Adam's walking around with God, right? And you think about what that means. It means something like this. An animal isn't in the world of good and evil. An animal, like Nietzsche points out, is beyond good and evil, right? Enraptured entirely by the actions of automatic instinct, governed by processes that are completely transcendent. The animal's nothing but a force of nature. There's no opposition between the animal and the world. The animal is the world. And just as in the case of the animal, prior to the eating of the apple, Adam walks around the garden with God. There's no discontinuity between him and the transcendent world as such. But as soon as he becomes naked, he hides. Well, why? Well, that doesn't need to be answered. All you have to do is think about it. Why would you hide if you know you're naked? Well, it's simple. You hide because you think you can get hurt. You think that whatever you are is so vulnerable that if it shows itself to the transcendent, to others, to the natural world, that something terrible will happen. And then you think, well, that's a pretty logical presupposition, right? Look at us. So God comes cruising around the garden after Adam and Eve eat the apple in the cool of the day, and Adam and Eve hide themselves among the trees of the garden. And God says to Adam, "Hey, where are you?" And Adam says, "I heard your voice, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself." And that story has bottomless depth Because it means something like this. At the beginning of Genesis, there's this notion that there's a transcendent relationship between the individual and God, right? The identity of Logos and the individual. Right? A notion, by the way, that our entire idea of intrinsic human right is predicated on, as we've been at some pains to demonstrate. A relationship between the limited and the limitless, eradicated by the dawn of self-consciousness. So what does that mean? Well, let's say you have a destiny, just for the sake of argument, right? Because you are a being with a tremendous history and an unbelievable potential. So let's say you have a destiny, just for the sake of argument. What would cause you to hide from that destiny? Well, obviously, your own reflections on your mortal vulnerability, right? How could I be characterized by any transcendent power whatsoever when I'm susceptible to social alienation, right? When I have this body which is capable of terrifying degeneration that will eventually decay into old age and that is bounded by death. How could I be good for anything? Which is precisely what this little story says. And so God figures out that Adam and Eve ate the fruit, and that's a pretty decisive move, because once you wake up, sorry, you're awake. And he says, and this is not an injunction, by the way, this is a description. All right, you've done it now. Unto the woman, he says, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow shalt thou bring forth children. Why? Why? Well, we have a big cortex, right? Really big. It grew fast, and what that meant is that there was an evolutionary arms race between skull size, date of birth, and pelvic diameter girth. The wider the pelvis, the less effectively you can walk. The larger the skull, the bigger the brain. The younger the baby, the more dependent and vulnerable. So what do we have in the case of human beings? The female human pelvis has already stretched to the limits of its structural capacity. So the hole in its center is as big as it can get without compromising the structural integrity of the pelvis, while still allowing women to walk and run. So how have babies adapted to that? Well, that's simple. A mammal of our size should have a gestation period of 2 years. We have a gestation period of 9 months. Why? You got to get the damn baby out before its head gets too big. What does that mean? Well, it means it's vulnerable, right? Nothing more vulnerable than a baby human being, except maybe a baby kangaroo, right? But it's got a pouch to hide in at least. So we're born vulnerable, right? Characteristic of the birth of the hero. Who suffers in childbirth? Women. Why? Baby skull's just a little bit too big. Has to be crunched and compacted during birth, right? The skull bones aren't joined together so that the baby's head can be squashed and visibly deformed during the process of birth. Prior to the 20th century, what was the death rate among women giving birth? 1 in 3, 1 in 5? Terrible. Why? That's the price you pay for self-consciousness. And thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. This is not an injunction, this is a description. The additional burden that dependent offspring place on women, place them at a disadvantage. What's the consequence of that from a historical perspective? Well, any feminist can answer that question, right? And unto Adam, he said, because you listened to your wife and have eaten the tree of which I commanded thee, saying, don't eat that. Cursed is the ground for thy sake. In sorrow shalt thou eat of it for all thy days of thy life. Fair enough, right? Once you're self-conscious, you work. Why? Well, animals don't work. Why do people work? Well, because we know, right? We know that if it isn't going to happen today, it's going to happen tomorrow. And if it isn't going to happen tomorrow, well, it's going to happen next week, or the week after, the month after, the year after. And we bloody well better prepare. So that's what we do. Constantly. Prepare and prepare and prepare. So we're not bounded and motivated by what's happening from second to second, like the animal is in its still paradisal state. We're constantly tormented by an endless string of what-if questions, because when we look at the unknown, we can see the possibility for everything, including our own punishment, our own torment, our own demise. And so we're motivated, like no other animal, to work. And so we work. But that is another aspect that alienates us from paradisal being. Thorn and thistles shall it bring forth for thee, and thou shalt eat the herb of the field. In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread, till thou return unto the ground. For dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. Right. Therefore the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden, to till the ground from whence he was taken. So he drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden cherubims, and a flaming sword which turned every way, to keep the way of the tree of life.